The Vrixathi Empire had ruled the stars for 6,000 years. They had conquered 17 star systems and destroyed countless species. Their ships were massive and dark, built for one purpose only: to hunt. The Vrixathi were predators, and they believed that the universe belonged to those who could take it by force. Commander Zyrith stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the blue planet on the screen. His forearms were crossed behind his back. His black eyes studied the world called Earth with hunger. The intelligence reports said this planet had billions of soft, weak creatures called humans. They had no claws, no fangs, no armor on their skin. They were slow and fragile. They would make perfect prey. The Vrixathi had a simple philosophy: the strong eat the weak. This was how nature worked on their home world, and this was how they believed the universe should work. They did not conquer planets for resources or territory. They conquered planets because hunting was in their blood. It was what they were born to do. Zyrith clicked his mandibles together in what passed for a smile among his kind. He had led many hunts before. He had watched entire civilizations fall and beg for mercy. The humans would be no different. In fact, they might be the easiest hunt of all. On Earth, life continued as it always had. People went to work. Children went to school. Families ate dinner together and watched television at night. They did not know that death was coming from the stars. In Houston, Texas, Captain Daniel Morris was working late at the United States Space Force Command Center. He was a tall man with tired eyes and graying hair. He had spent 20 years watching the skies, and he had never seen anything like what appeared on his screen that night. Strange heat signatures bloomed across the upper atmosphere. They were too large to be meteors and too slow to be satellites. Daniel called his supervisor, but before anyone could respond, the signatures multiplied. Within an hour, there were hundreds of them. Then the ships descended through the clouds. They came down over every major city on every continent: New York, London, Tokyo, Sydney, Cairo, Mumbai. The Vrixathi did not announce themselves. They did not ask for surrender or offer terms. They simply opened their hatches and released their hunters. In Chicago, a woman named Laura Bennett was walking home from her nursing shift at the hospital. She was 32 years old, with short brown hair and kind eyes. She was thinking about what she would make for dinner when she heard the screaming. She turned and saw something from a nightmare. Creatures stood 8 feet tall, covered in dark plates that looked like armor made of bone. They had 4 arms, each ending in claws that could cut through steel. Their faces had no expression, just black eyes and clicking mandibles that dripped with saliva. The creatures moved faster than anything Laura had ever seen. They grabbed people from the streets and threw them into metal pods that floated behind them. Men, women, children. The Vrixathi did not care. All prey was the same to them. Laura ran. She did not know where she was going. She just ran until her legs burned and her lungs screamed for air. Behind her, she could hear the clicking sounds of the hunters and the endless screaming of the taken. She hid in a basement with 17 other survivors. They stayed there for 3 days, listening to the sounds of the harvest above them. When they finally came out, the city was empty. Millions of people were gone. Across the world, the same horror played out in every nation. The Vrixathi hunted with terrible efficiency. Their weapons fired bolts of plasma that burned through walls and vehicles. Their armor shrugged off bullets and blades. They seemed to find human resistance amusing, like a rabbit trying to fight a wolf. The world governments tried to respond. Fighter jets took to the skies, but the Vrixathi shot them down like insects. Tank battalions rolled toward the landing zones, but they were overrun within hours. Nuclear weapons were considered, but the aliens had positioned themselves in the hearts of major cities. To strike them would mean killing millions of survivors. Within 72 hours, 40 million humans had been taken. The Vrixathi loaded them into their ships and sent them to processing centers in orbit. Some would become slaves. Some would become food. The Vrixathi did not waste any part of their prey. Commander Zyrith walked through the streets of a conquered city and felt satisfaction. His soldiers reported minimal losses. The humans had weapons, yes, but they did not know how to use them against a superior enemy. They panicked and fled. They hid and cried. They behaved exactly like prey animals should. He watched a group of hunters drag a family from their home. The father tried to fight, swinging a metal pipe at the soldiers. A Vrixathi warrior caught the pipe with one hand and broke the man's arm with another. The family was loaded into a containment pod while the father screamed in pain. Zyrith felt nothing. This was simply how the universe worked. The weak existed to serve the strong. Humans were weak, so they would serve the Vrixathi. It was the natural order. He sent a message to his superiors on the Vrixathi homeworld. Earth would be fully pacified within one standard cycle, approximately 3 Earth months. The humans were proving to be exactly what the intelligence reports had said: soft, slow, and helpless. They were perfect prey. Back in the basement in Chicago, Lavra Bennett held a crying child whose parents had been taken. She looked at the other survivors around her. They were afraid. They were broken. But some of them had something else in their eyes. Something hard and cold. Lara had seen that look before, in the eyes of patients who had been given death sentences by their doctors. It was the look of people who had nothing left to lose. It was the look of people who had decided they would not go quietly into the dark. She did not know it yet, but that look would spread across the entire planet. The Vrixathi had made a terrible mistake. They had studied human biology and technology. They had measured human strength and speed. But they had not studied human history. They did not know what humans did when they were pushed to the edge. The Vrixathi saw humans as prey. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first week after the invasion was pure chaos. Cities burned. Governments collapsed. Millions of people ran into the wilderness, hoping to escape the hunters that stalked every street and highway. The Vrixathi were everywhere, and they seemed unstoppable. But in the chaos, something began to change. In the mountains of Colorado, a former Army Ranger named Marcus Cole had gathered a group of survivors in an abandoned mining complex. Marcus was 41 years old, with a scarred face and hands that knew how to kill. He had spent 15 years fighting in wars across 3 continents. He had seen death up close many times, but he had never seen anything like the Vrixathi. The mine shaft went deep into the mountain, far enough that the alien sensors could not detect them. Marcus had brought together 63 survivors, ranging from soldiers to teachers to children. They had limited food, limited weapons, and limited hope. But they had something else. They had anger. Among the survivors was Dr. Catherine Price, a xenobiologist from the University of Colorado. Catherine was 55 years old, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her entire career wondering if life existed beyond Earth. Now she had her answer, and she wished she had never asked the question. But Catherine was a scientist, and scientists solved problems. While others mourned and prayed, she got to work. During the escape from Denver, Marcus and his fighters had killed 3 Vrixathi soldiers. It had cost them 8 human lives, but they had brought the bodies with them. Catherine spent sleepless nights cutting them open, studying their organs, testing their tissues, and learning their secrets. What she found gave her hope. The Vrixathi had evolved on a world with gravity twice as strong as Earth. Their home planet had a thick atmosphere filled with toxic gases. Their bodies had developed armor to withstand crushing pressure and blunt force trauma. On their own world, nothing could hurt them. But Earth was different. Catherine discovered that the Vrixathi Armor was designed to spread impact over a wide area. It could stop a hammer blow or a car crash without damage. But it was surprisingly weak against sharp, focused attacks. A bullet that hit flat against the armor would bounce off. But a needle-pointed projectile could punch through the gaps in the plates. She also found that the Vrixati had poor night vision. On their home world, the thick atmosphere blocked most light, so they had evolved to hunt by thermal signatures and sound. They could see body heat from 100 meters away. But in darkness, they were nearly blind to anything that did not produce heat. Catherine shared her findings with Marcus, and Marcus began the plan. Meanwhile, across the country, other survivors were making their own discoveries. In Detroit, a mechanical engineer named Samuel Grant had taken over an abandoned automotive factory. Samuel was 38 years old, a quiet man who had spent his life building machines. Now he would build machines that killed. His team had recovered Vrixati weapons from fallen soldiers. The alien plasma rifles were powerful but crude, designed for creatures with 4 arms and completely different muscles. Samuel took them apart piece by piece and learned how they worked. Then he built something better. He combined Vrixati power cells with human precision engineering. The result was a rifle that human soldiers could use, one that fired bolts of energy capable of punching through alien armor. It was not as powerful as the original Vrixati weapons, but it was accurate. And humans, Samuel knew, were very good at hitting what they aimed at. In Montana, a different kind of weapon was being developed. Maria Santos had been a competitive shooter before the invasion. She had won national championships with rifles and pistols. She had spent her whole life learning to put bullets exactly where she wanted them. Now she taught others. Maria gathered hunters, veterans, and anyone who could hold a weapon steady. She taught them to shoot from concealment, to control their breathing, to become invisible in the wilderness. She learned that Vrixati soldiers never looked up, so she trained her fighters to attack from trees and cliffsides. She discovered that the aliens could track thermal signatures. So she showed her people how to mask their body heat with mud and cold water. The Vrixati had never met prey that studied them back. In his flagship, orbiting Earth, Commander Zyrith began to receive troubling reports. Isolated attacks on collection parties. Hunters who entered the wilderness and did not return. Equipment that was sabotaged in the night. At first, Zyrith dismissed these reports as minor problems. Prey animals sometimes fought back when cornered. It meant nothing. The harvest would continue on schedule. Then his best lieutenant was killed. The officer was leading a hunting party through the forests of Oregon when a projectile struck him in the head. It came from 800 meters away, through dense trees, and it hit the exact gap between his skull plates. He was dead before he hit the ground. No prey species they had ever hunted could strike from such distance with such precision. Zyrith felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It took him a moment to recognize the emotion, because it had been so many years since he had experienced it. He was afraid. Back in the Colorado mountains, Marcus Cole received a radio message from a resistance group in Kansas. They had made contact with surviving military units. The scattered human forces were beginning to communicate, to share information, to coordinate. Catherine Price had finished her research. She knew how to kill Vrixati more efficiently. Samuel Grant had built a prototype weapon that worked better than anything the aliens had. Maria Santos had trained 100 fighters who could shoot the wings off a fly at 300 meters. The humans were learning. They were adapting. They were becoming something the Vrixati had never encountered before. Marcus looked at the map spread before him, marked with every alien position his scouts had identified. He looked at the faces of his fighters, no longer afraid but filled with cold determination. The Vrixati had come to Earth, looking for prey. They were about to discover that they had woken up the most dangerous predator the galaxy had ever seen. 3 months after the invasion, the Vrixathi noticed that something was wrong. At first, the numbers did not seem important. A patrol would go missing here. A supply convoy would be destroyed there. A collection team would report losing a few soldiers to unknown attacks. These things happened in any conquest. Prey sometimes got lucky, but the numbers kept growing. Commander Zyrith sat in his command chamber and studied the casualty reports. In the first month, the Vrixathi had lost 200 soldiers across the entire planet. In the second month, they had lost 800. In the third month, they had lost over 2,000. The humans were not getting lucky. They were getting better done in an underground bunker beneath the wheat fields of Kansas. General Nathan Perry coordinated what remained of the United States military. Nathan was 60 years old, a career soldier who had led troops in a dozen conflicts. He had thought he would retire to a quiet life. Instead, he was fighting the most important war in human history. Working beside him was Lisa Tran, a former intelligence analyst who had spent weeks studying captured Vrixathi communications. Lisa was 34 years old, a small woman with quick hands and a quicker mind. She had cracked codes for the government for 10 years. Now she cracked alien languages. What she discovered changed everything. The Vrixathi had conquered 17 star systems. They had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than humanity. But they had done so because none of those civilizations had understood what was happening until it was too late. The Vrixathi hunted in a specific way. They arrived in overwhelming force, created terror and chaos, and harvested their prey before any organized resistance could form. But humanity had survived the initial chaos. And now humans were organizing. Lisa found something else in the alien communications. The Vrixathi had no concept of total war. They hunted. They harvested. They moved on. They had never faced an enemy that refused to accept defeat, that learned from every engagement, that turned every weakness into a weapon. The Vrixathi did not know how to fight a real war. They only knew how to hunt, and humans had stopped being prey. Marcus Cole and his mountain fighters had developed tactics that made the Vrixathi afraid to leave their bases. They attacked at night, when the aliens could not see. They struck from above, from positions the hunters never thought to check. They used the aliens' own confidence against them. One of Marcus's most effective tactics involved Vrixathi communication. The aliens used pheromone signals to coordinate their hunts. Different scents meant different commands. Gather here, pursue that target, retreat to safety. Marcus's fighters began, capturing live Vrixathi soldiers and harvesting. Their scent glands dot, then they used those glands to create false. TRALSA Vrixathi patrol would pick up pheromone signal indicating that prey had been spotted nearby. They would follow the signal into a canyon or a forest, expecting to find helpless humans. Instead, they found explosives, snipers, and death. Catherine Price had continued her research in the mountain laboratory. She had synthesized a neurotoxin from local plants that affected the Vrixathi nervous system. The poison was completely harmless to humans. But a single drop would cause a Vrixathi soldier to lose control of his muscles, falling helpless to the ground while his brain remained fully aware. The mountain fighters coated their bullets with this toxin. A shot that would normally wound became a guaranteed kill. The Vrixathi began to fear any engagement with human fighters, knowing that even a scratch could mean death. Samuel Grant's factory had grown into a full production facility. He had trained hundreds of workers to build the hybrid weapons he had designed. Every week, thousands of rifles left the factory and made their way to resistance cells across the country. But Samuel built more than weapons. He studied the Vrixathi power systems and learned how to overload them. He designed bombs that could destroy alien vehicles. He created jamming devices that blocked Vrixathi communications. Every piece of technology the aliens brought to Earth became a weapon that humans could use against them. The resistance cells began to coordinate their attacks. Lisa Tran's intelligence work allowed them to predict Rixathi movements. General Perry's military experience turned scattered fighters into an effective guerrilla army. They struck at supply lines, at communication centers, at isolated patrols. The Rixathi controlled the cities, but they controlled nothing else. Commander Xyrith requested reinforcements from the home world. His superiors were confused by the request. How could a primitive prey species require additional military resources? Had Xyrith grown weak? Xyrith struggled to explain what he was facing. The humans were not fighting like prey. They were fighting like something the Rixathi had never encountered. They learned from their defeats. They adapted to Rixathi tactics. They turned their own weaknesses into traps. When the Rixathi used thermal sensors, humans learned to mask their heat signatures. When the Rixathi hunted by sound, humans learned to move in silence. When the Rixathi relied on their armor, humans developed weapons that pierced it. Every advantage the Rixathi possessed was slowly being neutralized. The reinforcements arrived 4 months after the invasion. 10,000 fresh soldiers, eager for the hunt. Xyrith sent them into the countryside to crush the resistance once and for all. Half of them died in the first week. The humans had prepared for this. They had mapped every road, every forest, every canyon where the aliens might travel. They had planted explosives and set ambushes. They had created killing grounds where Rixathi soldiers walked in but did not walk out. Maria Santos led a group of 50 snipers who killed over 300 aliens in a single night. They fired from hidden positions, disappeared before the Rixathi could respond, and reappeared somewhere else to kill again. The aliens never saw their attackers. They only saw their soldiers falling dead. In his command chamber, Xyrith looked at the casualty reports and felt something he had never experienced before. He felt like prey. The hunters had become the hunted. The predators had become victims. The Rixathi Empire, which had conquered 17 star systems, was losing to a species they had dismissed as weak and primitive. Xyrith understood now. Too late what he was facing. Humans were not prey animals who had gotten lucky. They were predators who had been surprised. And now they were awake, they were angry, and they were coming for blood. 6 months after the invasion, the war had changed completely. The Rixathi still controlled the skies. Their ships orbited Earth, and their aircraft patrolled the major cities. But on the ground, they controlled almost nothing. The countryside had become a nightmare for them. Every forest, every mountain, every stretch of open land was a killing ground, where humans waited with weapons and hate. The stories began to spread among the Rixathi soldiers, whispered in their barracks at night. Stories of patrols that entered the wilderness and never returned. Stories of hunters found dead with neat holes punched through their armor. Stories of shadows that killed without making a sound. One story became famous among both species. Rixathi hunting party of 200 soldiers had entered the forests of Oregon in pursuit of a refugee column. These were experienced hunters, veterans of campaigns across multiple star systems. They moved with confidence, certain that they would catch their prey and add to the harvest. Only 3 soldiers emerged from those forests alive. They were found wandering at the edge of the tree line. Their weapons gone, their armor cracked, their eyes empty. When their commanders questioned them, they could barely speak. They talked about shadows that came from the trees without warning. They talked about traps that appeared from nowhere, explosives and pits and wires that cut through armor like paper. They talked about humans who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts. Most of all, they talked about the fear. The Rixathi had never known fear before. On their home world, they were the apex predators. In their empire, they were the hunters. But in those Oregon forests, They had learned what it felt like to be prey. They had learned what it meant to be hunted by something that wanted them dead. The three survivors never fought again. Their minds had broken in those woods. Commander Xyrith tried to understand what had happened. He studied human history, looking for some explanation for what his species was facing. What he found disturbed him deeply. Humans were not like any prey species the Vrixathi had encountered. They had not evolved on a gentle world where life was easy. They had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them every day. They had survived ice ages that froze their world. They had survived plagues that killed millions. They had survived famines, floods, fires, and each other. Most importantly, humans were persistent hunters on Earth. Humans had chased their prey for hours, sometimes days, until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. They had tracked creatures across entire continents. They had driven megafauna to extinction, not through superior strength, but through patience, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to give up. The Vrixathi were ambush predators. They struck quickly and overwhelmed their targets. But humans were something different. Humans did not stop. They did not give up. They would follow an enemy to the ends of the earth and beyond. Xyrith began to realize that his people had made a terrible mistake. Across the world, the human resistance grew stronger every day. In Nebraska, a high school teacher named Eric Dawson had become a legend. When the invasion began, Eric had been grading papers in his classroom. Now he led a group of teenagers who had destroyed an entire Vrixathi forward operating base using homemade explosives and hunting rifles. Eric had taught history before the war. He knew about guerrilla warfare, about how small groups of determined fighters could defeat larger enemies. He taught his young fighters the lessons of history, from the American Revolution to the resistance movements of World War II. The Vrixathi had technology and strength. The humans had cunning and will. In Georgia, a veterinarian named Amanda Foster had used her knowledge of biology to develop new weapons. She had studied Catherine Price's research on Vrixathi physiology and taken it further. She created a biological agent that targeted the aliens' respiratory systems, spreading through the air and killing any Vrixathi who breathed it. The agent was deployed in a major alien base. 3,000 Vrixathi soldiers died choking on their own fluids while humans watched from a safe distance. The resistance was no longer just surviving. It was winning. Commander Xyrith made a desperate decision. If the humans would not surrender, he would break them through terror. He ordered his ships to bombard several human population centers from orbit. Plasma rained down from the sky, destroying cities that had once held millions of people. Xyrith expected the humans to lose hope. He expected them to realize that resistance was futile, that the Vrixathi controlled too much power for them to overcome. Instead, the attacks only made the humans angrier. Lavra Bennett, the nurse who had survived the first days of the invasion in Chicago, heard about the bombardment while working in a resistance hospital. She had spent 6 months saving human lives, watching people die from Vrixathi weapons, and carrying the weight of everything she had lost. When she heard about the cities destroyed, something changed in her. She had been afraid for so long. Now she was not afraid anymore. She was something else entirely. She volunteered for a combat unit that night. The Vrixathi had a saying on their home world: "A wounded beast is dangerous, but a cornered beast is deadly." They had wounded humanity, and they had cornered humanity, and now they were learning what humans did when they had nothing left to lose. Humans fought. They fought with weapons and fists and teeth. They fought in daylight and darkness. They fought in forests and mountains and the ruins of their cities. They fought because fighting was all they had left, and because they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. The orbital bombardment did not break humanity's spirit. forged it into something harder than steel. Commander Zerif looked at the reports from across the planet and saw the truth that he had been avoiding for months. The Vrixathi were not going to win this war. They had thought they were hunting prey, but they had found something else entirely. They had found an enemy that would never stop fighting. And now that enemy was coming for them. 1 year after the invasion, Commander Zyrith stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched his empire burn. The great Vrixathi fleet, which had arrived at Earth with over 200 warships, now numbered only 17. The rest had been destroyed, disabled, or captured by creatures that the Vrixathi had once called prey. Zyrith remembered the confidence he had felt when he first saw Earth on his screens. He remembered thinking that this world would be an easy conquest, that humans were soft and weak and helpless. He remembered laughing at the idea that these primitive beings could ever threaten the hunters of the Vrixathi Empire. He was not laughing now. The humans had not simply repelled the invasion. They had done something far worse. They had learned. Every piece of Vrixathi technology that fell into human hands became a weapon against its creators. Human scientists studied alien power systems and made them better. Human engineers took apart plasma rifles and built versions that were more accurate and more deadly. Human generals learned Vrixathi tactics and developed counters for everyone. General Nathan Perry now commanded a unified human military that stretched across the entire planet. The scattered resistance cells had become a coordinated army, equipped with hybrid weapons that outperformed anything the Vrixathi possessed. The prey had become predators, and they were hungry for revenge. Catherine Price had continued her research throughout the war. She had developed biological weapons that targeted Vrixathi exclusively, killing aliens while leaving humans completely unharmed. These weapons had cleared entire bases in hours, leaving nothing but dead invaders for the human forces to walk over. But the greatest achievement belonged to Samuel Grant Dodd in his factory in Detroit. Samuel had done what no one thought possible. Using salvaged alien technology and human engineering, he had built humanity's first interstellar warship. The ship was called the Resolute. It was not as large as the Vrixathi vessels, but it was faster and more maneuverable. Its weapons were a combination of human precision and alien power. Its crew was made up of survivors who had fought from the first day of the invasion. When the Resolute rose into the sky for the first time, people across the world stopped to watch. For a year, humans had looked up at the stars with fear, knowing that death waited in the darkness. Now they looked up with something else. They looked up with hope. The final battle began on a clear morning in autumn. The human fleet, consisting of the Resolute and dozens of smaller vessels built from captured alien craft, moved to engage the remaining Vrixathi ships. General Perry coordinated the attack from his command bunker, while Colonel Marcus Cole led the ground assault on the last Vrixathi stronghold on Earth. Marcus had changed since the early days of the invasion. His hair had gone gray, and new scars marked his face and arms. He had lost friends, soldiers, and pieces of himself in this war, but he had never lost his determination. He had promised himself on the first night in that Colorado mine that he would see the Vrixathi defeated. Now he was going to keep that promise. His forces moved through the ruins of what had once been a major city. The Vrixathi had fortified the area, building walls and defensive positions from the rubble of human buildings. They had thousands of soldiers inside, the last significant ground force on the planet. Marcus did not care about the walls or the soldiers. He had spent a year learning how to kill Vrixathi, and he was very good at it. The assault was brutal and efficient. Human fighters used every tactic they had developed during the resistance, moving through shadows, striking from unexpected angles, and disappearing before the aliens could respond. Catherine Price's toxins coated every bullet. Samuel Grant's weapons punched through Vrixathi armor like paper. In orbit, The Resolute engaged Xerath's flagship directly. Laura Bennett, who had survived the first days of horror in Chicago and had watched her city burn in the orbital bombardment, commanded one of the ship's weapon batteries. She fired with cold precision, putting shots exactly where they would do the most damage. Captain Daniel Morris, who had seen the first anomalies on his screens over a year ago, coordinated the orbital engagement from the Resolute's bridge. He had spent his life watching the skies, waiting for something to come from the stars. Now he was making sure that what came from the stars would never threaten Earth again. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Vrixathi fleet was destroyed. Commander Xerath died when a human missile penetrated his flagship's reactor, turning the great ship into an expanding cloud of debris. He spent his last moments feeling something that his ancestors had never known. He felt what it was like to be prey, on the ground. Marcus Cole stood in the ruins of the last Vrixathi stronghold and looked at the bodies of the fallen. Humans and aliens lay together in the dust, the final casualties of a war that had changed both species forever. The invasion was over. Humanity had won, but the war was not finished. In the weeks that followed, the people of Earth made a decision. The Vrixathi had come to their world looking for prey. They had killed millions. They had taken families, destroyed cities, and tried to harvest humanity like animals. They would pay for what they had done. Samuel Grant's factories began building more ships. Human engineers studied the captured Vrixathi vessels and learned their secrets. Scientists mapped the routes to the Vrixathi home world using data recovered from enemy computers. The hunted were going hunting. 1 year after the invasion ended, a fleet of human warships left Earth and headed for the stars. They carried soldiers, scientists, and survivors. They carried weapons designed to kill Vrixathi and nothing else. They carried the memory of 40 million people who had been taken in the first horrible days, and they carried a message for the galaxy. The Vrixathi had told the universe that Earth was a hunting ground, a world of soft prey waiting to be harvested. Humanity sent a different message. They sent the coordinates of every species the Vrixathi had conquered. They sent recordings of what had happened on Earth, of how a primitive species had defeated the greatest hunters in the galaxy. They sent a promise. The hunters were coming, and they would not stop until every Vrixathi world had learned what Earth had taught them. Humans were not prey. Humans were something far more dangerous. Humans were survivors. And survivors never forget.